The Wyoming air in the early autumn of 1889 had a brittle edge to it, a taste of soot and sorrow that clung to the back of the throat. For a week, a wildfire had chewed its way across the high plains, leaving a scar of blackened earth and skeletal trees in its wake. Eli Grant rode his steady buckskin, Buster, through the heart of the desolation. The sun was a hot brass coin in a sky bleached of color, and the silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of his horse's hooves on the charred ground and the soft creak of saddle leather. He was a man carved from the land itself, tall and lean, with hands calloused by rope and rain, and eyes the color of a faded blue sky that had seen too much sun and too little rain. He wasn't looking for trouble, merely charting the fire's edge to ensure his own small ranch, nestled in a protected valley miles away, was safe. It was then that he saw it, the ruin of the old Crossroads Chapel, its steeple a jagged finger pointing a final accusation at the heavens. It had been a simple clapboard structure, a place for circuit preachers and the rare traveling wedding. Now, it was a ribcage of blackened timbers, its roof gone, its soul scoured out by the flames, a bitter, acrid smell, the ghost of burned pine and holy books, still hung in the air. Curiosity, or perhaps a deeper, quieter instinct, made Eli dismount. He looped Buster's reins around the scorched husk of a hitching post and walked toward the gaping doorway. Inside, the world was a study in gray and gold. Ash, fine as powdered silk, coated every surface, stirred into gentle eddies by the breeze sighing through the broken walls. Slanted shafts of afternoon sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating dancing motes of dust and soot. It was a tomb, a place of profound and final endings. And in the center of it all, she sat. At first, he thought she was an apparition, a trick of the light in his own sun-weary eyes. She was huddled on the floor beside what was left of the altar, a heap of charred, unrecognizable wood. A woman, or a girl. It was hard to tell. Dressed in what had once been a white wedding gown, the dress was a wreck, its lace hem blackened and frayed, its bodice smeared with grime and soot. She was a lily crushed into the mud, a fallen star coated in the debris of her own extinguished light. Her hair, a dark tumble of chestnut, was a tangled nest of ash and pine needles. Her bare feet were black, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees as if to hold herself together. She did not look up as he approached, his boots making soft, crunching sounds in the ash. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. She gave no sign she'd heard him. He took a few steps closer. He could see the faint tremor that ran through her frame, a constant, shivering hum like a plucked wire. Her face, when he finally saw it, was a mask of soot. But beneath it, her skin was pale as milk. It was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were wide and dark, but utterly vacant, like two polished stones at the bottom of a dry well. They were fixed on something far beyond the ruined chapel, something only she could see. And in their depths, there was a terror so pure and profound it was almost a physical thing. He followed her gaze, but there was nothing there but the burned wall. His eyes scanned the floor around her. A few feet away lay a brittle flake of black that might have been a letter. He knelt, his knees cracking, and gently picked it up. Most of it disintegrated at his touch, but a single fragment held. The ink faded but legible. "Promise you a forever." The rest was ash. Near it, half buried in the grime, glinted a thin band of gold, a wedding ring, simple, unadorned, and abandoned. Eli stood, the silence pressing in. He unhooked the canteen from his belt and offered it. "Water, ma'am." Her head turned slowly, a creaking, mechanical motion. Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting second, the emptiness was replaced by a flash of raw, animal fear. She flinched back, pressing herself against the ruined altar, a small, wounded sound escaping her lips. He held his ground, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He set the canteen on the floor, a safe distance from her. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, his voice gentle. "But you can't stay here." He waited. The sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows through the chapel's skeleton. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched him, her breath coming in shallow, ragged puffs. Eli knew he couldn't leave her. The coyotes would be hunting by nightfall, and the cold of the high plains was unforgiving, even in early autumn. "I'm gonna have to lift you," he said, more to himself than to her. He moved forward, expecting her to fight, to scream, to bolt. Instead, when his hands touched her arms, she went completely limp, as if all the bones had been removed from her body. She was light as a bundle of dry sticks. As he lifted her head lolled against his shoulder, and he felt the violent, bird-like flutter of her heart against his chest. The ride back to his ranch was the longest of his life. He sat her in front of him on the saddle, one arm securely around her waist. She remained boneless and silent, her gaze fixed on the scorched horizon. She smelled of smoke, fear, and something else, something like deep, abiding shame. He didn't know who she was, where she came from, or what unspeakable thing had happened in that chapel. He only knew he was holding the survivor of it. The nearest town, Redemption, was little more than a dusty street with a general store, a saloon, and a blacksmith. 2 days later, Eli rode in for supplies. Leaving the strange woman asleep in the small spare room of his cabin, the town was already buzzing. News traveled fast in these empty spaces. Silas Blackwood, the grizzled proprietor of the general store, leaned over the counter as Eli paid for flour and beans. "Heard you found something out in the burn zone," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "A woman," Eli confirmed, not offering more. "The bride," Silas nodded, as if it were an established fact. "Whole town's talking. They say she was set to marry that land speculator, Barrow, man with deep pockets and a mean streak a mile wide." Eli remained silent, packing his goods. "Word is," Silas continued, unable to help himself, "Barrow got into a dispute with the Black Creek gang. Owed him money. They showed up on his wedding day to collect. Things got ugly. Fire started. And when the smoke cleared, Barrow was found with a bullet in his chest. The girl, Clara, I think her name is, she was the only one left. They reckon the smoke and the shock of it all took her memory. Clara. So she had a name." Eli felt a strange pang. It made her real. He looked at Silas. "That's a lot of reckoning for a town with no sheriff." "It's the only story that makes sense." Silas shrugged. "A runaway bride, a murdered groom. You best be careful. Eli, trouble like that has a way of sticking to a man." Eli just nodded, shouldered his sack, and left. He didn't believe in stories that made perfect sense. Life was rarely so tidy. Back at the ranch, his care was met with the same impenetrable wall of silence. He'd leave a tray of food, stew, fresh bread, a cup of milk by her door. Sometimes it was gone when he returned. Other times, it sat untouched, growing cold. He washed the tattered wedding dress and left it, folded, on a chair, along with one of his own clean flannel shirts. She wore the shirt. The dress remained folded. He tried to speak to her, offering simple observations about the weather or the horses, but his words fell into the silence of her room like stones into a well. She spent her days sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the small window at the vast, empty plains. Any sudden movement, any unexpected sound, the scrape of a chair, the click of the door latch, made her jump as if struck. If he came too close, she would shrink into herself, her hands flying up to shield her face. Touch was an agony for her. He learned to give her a wide berth, to exist around her like a careful moon orbiting a shattered planet. The truth of her torment came not in the light of day, but in the dead of night. A few nights after he brought her home, he was jolted awake by a sound from her room. It wasn't loud. It was a small, muffled sob, thin and sharp as a shard of glass. He lay still, listening, his heart aching with a helpless pity. The sobs grew, punctuated by whimpers of sheer terror. And then he heard the words, whispered so faintly he almost thought he'd imagined them, but they carried through the thin wooden walls with chilling clarity. "I don't want to marry him." A pause, then a more desperate plea, a choked, broken sound. "No, please, I don't want to." Eli closed his eyes. Silas and the whole town of Redemption were wrong. This wasn't a woman who had lost her memory. This was a woman who was being hunted by it. The days bled one into the next, measured by the slow crawl of the sun across the immense, indifferent sky. Eli Grant understood the language of patience. It was the currency of his life, learned from waiting for stubborn calves to be born, for rain to fall, for winter to break. He applied this same steady, unhurried rhythm to the silent, wounded woman living under his roof. He never forced an interaction, never demanded a name or a story. He built a wall of quiet reliability around her, brick by simple, unassuming brick. Every morning, he would leave a tray with a bowl of warm oatmeal and a cup of coffee on the small crate outside her door. In the evening, it would be a plate of whatever he'd cooked for himself: venison stew, fried potatoes, beans with bacon. He spoke to the closed door in a low murmur, not expecting an answer. "Food's here, ma'am. Hope you find it to your liking." He was talking to a ghost, but he did it anyway. He noticed the curtain in her window, a simple piece of calico, had been torn by the wind, its flapping a constant, frantic sound. One afternoon while she sat inside, he took it down without a word, brought it into his main room, and sat by the fire, his large, calloused fingers working a needle and thread with surprising dexterity. He mended the tear with small, even stitches, then quietly hung it back in its place. He was not just fixing a piece of cloth, he was mending a tiny corner of her broken world, offering an order he hoped she might recognize. He made it clear, in his quiet way, that this was her sanctuary. One evening, standing a respectful distance from her open doorway, she had begun leaving it ajar. He spoke to the shadows within. "You can stay as long as you need," he said. "A week, a year. Don't make no difference to me. There's no rent to be paid here but your own peace of mind." Slowly, like a winter-starved animal inching toward a proffered hand, she began to respond. It started with a nod. He'd leave the breakfast tray, and as he turned to walk away, he'd see her head dip in a faint, almost imperceptible acknowledgement from the shadows of her room. It was a seismic event in their silent world. Then, a week later, she emerged. He was in the small vegetable patch behind the cabin, a patch he fought to keep alive against the dry Wyoming soil. He was pulling water from the well, his shoulders straining with the weight of the buckets. When he saw her standing on the porch, she was wearing his flannel shirt, which hung on her small frame like a tent, her bare feet dusty. She just watched him, her expression as unreadable as ever. He didn't say a word, just nodded a greeting and continued his work, making trip after trip from the well to the thirsty rows of squash and corn. On his fourth trip, he found a second bucket, one he used for feed, sitting next to the well. She was gone. He looked toward the cabin and saw her slip back inside. He understood. The next day, she was there again, and this time, she took the second bucket, filled it halfway. It was all she could manage, and followed him to the garden. She moved with a slow, careful grace, pouring the water gently around the base of the plants. They worked like that for an hour, in a silence that was no longer empty, but shared. It was the first time she had offered a piece of herself back to the world, but still, she did not speak. The change came with a storm. It rolled in from the west one night, a bruised purple mass of cloud that swallowed the stars and choked the moon. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the window panes and clawed at the roof shingles. Then came the thunder. Not a distant rumble, but a violent, concussive crack that seemed to split the sky directly over the cabin. Eli was in the barn, securing the horses who were stamping and whinnying in nervous agitation. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, was followed by a flash of lightning that lit the entire world in a stark, skeletal white. In that brief, brilliant moment, he saw her through the cabin window. She was standing in the middle of her room, her silhouette rigid. A deep sense of unease settled in him. He finished with the horses and made his way through the first fat drops of rain to the cabin. The wind tore at his coat. Inside, the fire was burning low. He could hear a sound from her room, a high, thin whimpering, like a trapped animal. He knocked softly on her door. "Clara." He used the name Silas had given him. It felt right. There was no answer, only the sound of a frantic, panicked sob. He pushed the door open. She was huddled in the far corner, her body curled into a tight ball, her hands clamped over her ears. The room was lit by another flash of lightning, and in its glare, he saw that her eyes were wide with a terror that went far beyond a simple fear of storms. She was not in his cabin. She was somewhere else entirely, back in the heart of the fire, in the center of the nightmare that had branded her. The next clap of thunder was deafening. She screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony. In that moment, all the careful distance he had maintained evaporated. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before her. "It's all right," he said, his voice a low anchor in the chaos. "It's just the storm. You're safe here." She didn't seem to see him. She was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. He reached out, slowly, and put his hand on her shoulder. He expected her to flinch, to recoil as she always did. Instead, she collapsed against him, burying her face in his chest, her small hands clutching at his shirt. He froze, surprised by the sudden, desperate weight of her. Then he wrapped his arms around her, holding her firmly, trying to lend his own solidness to her dissolving world. He held her like that for a long time, rocking gently as the storm raged outside, his chin resting on the top of her ash-scented hair. For the first time since he'd found her, she allowed herself to be held. She let another human being touch her. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and sage. The sky was the color of slate, and a fine mist hung in the air. When Eli rose, her room was empty, her door was wide open, and she was gone. A cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He pulled on his boots and went outside. He saw her immediately. She was a small, desolate figure far out on the plains, sitting on the wet ground, her knees drawn up to her chest, the gray dawn light enveloping her. She had run. The intimacy of the previous night, the crack in her armor, had been too much to bear. His first instinct was to go to her, to bring her back to the warmth of the cabin. But he stopped himself. He stood on the porch, the damp chill seeping into his bones, and simply watched. He saw the tremble in her shoulders. He saw her head drop into her hands. This was a battle she had to fight on her own terms. Chasing her would only make him another hunter in her life. So he waited, granting her the dignity of her own fear, respecting the wild, panicked thing that lived inside her. The landscape itself seemed to hold its breath. The sky was a vast, weeping gray. In the corral, the horses, still unsettled from the storm, trotted in nervous circles, their breath pluming in the cold air, their movements agitated and unpredictable. They were a reflection of her own turmoil, a herd of wild impulses with no clear direction. Eli watched it all, the woman and the horses and the grieving sky, and understood that they were all part of the same raw, untamed story. She came back after nightfall. He had built up the fire and was sitting by it, cleaning a rifle. When the door creaked open, she stood there, dripping and shivering, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked through. Her eyes, usually so distant, were fixed on him, filled with a desperate, questioning light. She walked slowly toward him until she was standing just before his chair. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply waited. She raised a trembling hand, hesitated for a moment, and then pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. Her touch was ice cold. It wasn't a caress, but an act of profound inquiry. He could feel the fine tremor in her fingers. She held her hand there for a long moment, her dark, searching eyes locked on his, as if trying to read the rhythm of his soul. Then, as if burned, she snatched her hand back and took a stumbling step away, her fear and her need warring on her pale face. Eli didn't ask where she had been. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He simply reached for the thick wool blanket folded over the back of his chair, stood up, and draped it around her shaking shoulders. He pulled it snug, his hands brushing her arms for only a second. She flinched, but didn't pull away. He looked down at her, his expression calm and steady. "You don't have to tell me a thing," he said, his voice low and certain. "Not till you're ready to—" His words that night, a simple offering of patience, shifted something in the quiet air of the ranch. The promise not to ask, not to demand, was a key turning a lock he hadn't known was there. For Clara, who had only known coercion and expectation, the gift of choice was as foreign and vital as rainfall in a desert. She did not begin to speak, not right away. Instead, she began to do— It started small. She took over the task of feeding the half-dozen chickens that scratched in the dirt behind the cabin, her movements slow and deliberate as she scattered the corn. Eli watched from a distance, never interfering, never offering praise that might feel like a judgment. He simply left the feed sack where she could find it. Soon, she was collecting the eggs, her small hands surprisingly gentle as she cradled their warm, fragile weight. She moved from the chickens to the house itself. She swept the rough-hewn floorboards with a quiet intensity, raising clouds of dust that danced in the sunbeams. She learned the rhythm of his life and began to anticipate it, placing a cup of hot coffee on the table moments before he came in from the morning chores, her eyes fixed on the tabletop, never on his face. He'd murmur a "Thank you, Clara," and he would see the faintest blush rise on her neck. Eli never asked her to do these things, but he did not stop her. He understood this was her way of reclaiming a piece of herself, of proving she was more than a creature to be cared for, more than a victim. In work, there was purpose, and in purpose, there was a fragile kind of strength. He was careful not to let her do too much, once taking a heavy bucket of water from her hands and carrying it himself. She looked up at him, a flash of something, protest, shame, in her eyes. He just smiled, a slight, weary creasing at the corners of his own eyes. "My chore," he said simply, and that was that. Their first conversations were clumsy, halting affairs, built from single words. "Coffee?" he'd ask, holding the pot. A nod. Then, a week later, a whispered, "Please." He'd be mending a bridle, the scent of leather and oil filling the small cabin. "Cold out," he would state, not looking at her, and she, from her seat by the window, would reply to the glass. "Yes." Each word was a stone carefully chosen and placed, building a bridge across the chasm of her silence. He learned that her voice was low and soft, with a huskiness that spoke of disuse and remembered tears. He never pushed for more, letting her set the pace, content with these small, precious offerings. One afternoon, they sat on the porch shelling beans, the rhythmic snap and pop the only sound between them. The sun was warm on their shoulders. He'd been watching her hands, how they moved with a steady, practiced grace. He thought of his own mother's hands, which had never been idle. "My mother," he said, his voice casual, as if the thought had just occurred to him. She had a past people in town like to whisper about. Clara's hands stilled for a brief second before resuming their work. She did not look at him, but he knew she was listening. She wasn't from around here. Came west alone. They said things, that she'd been a saloon girl in Denver. that she'd had a child out of wedlock. Didn't matter if it was true. In their eyes, she was spoiled goods. No respectable man would have her. He paused, tossing a handful of shelled beans into the metal bowl between them. So, she wasn't respectable. Neither was my father, I guess. He looked out at the rolling plains, his eyes distant. He was just a ranch hand then. He met her, saw who she was, not what they said she was. He married her a month later. The town turned their backs. The preacher wouldn't wed him. They had to get a traveling judge. They lost friends, lost work. They left that town and came here, built this place with their own 2 hands. Just the 2 of them against the world. He fell silent. The pile of empty pods grew. Clara had stopped working now, her hands resting in her lap, her knuckles white. She was looking at him, her gaze direct and piercing. "What if," she began, her voice barely a whisper, so soft the breeze nearly stole it. "What if someone has done something wrong, a sin that cannot be forgiven?" The question hung in the air, heavy and raw. It was the first real question she had ever asked him, and he knew it was not a theoretical one. It was the central, burning query of her existence. She was asking for judgment, for a verdict. Eli stopped his work and met her gaze. He didn't offer easy comfort or false assurances. He gave her the hard, simple truth as he saw it. "Well," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "I reckon that raises a bigger question. Clara, who gets to be the judge, and who has to live with it?" He let the words settle, a quiet challenge to the invisible court that held its session in her mind. He stood, brushing the dust from his trousers. "Sun'll be setting soon. There's a place I want to show you." He led her not on horseback, but on foot, up the long, sloping hill behind the cabin. The wind was stronger up here, a steady, insistent force that whipped her dark hair across her face and pressed his shirt flat against his back. The dry prairie grass whispered and rustled all around them, a sound like 1,000 secrets being shared. At the summit, the whole world seemed to lay at their feet, a vast, painted canvas of golds, reds, and deep purples as the sun began its slow descent. They stood without speaking, watching the spectacle. The wind was a wild, cleansing thing. It felt as if it could blow right through you, taking all the dust and pain and leaving you scoured and new. In the midst of that raw, elemental beauty, surrounded by the rustling grass and the endless sky, something in Clara's face softened. The tight, guarded lines around her mouth relaxed, as the final sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, bathing the world in a soft, ethereal glow. A small, wondrous thing happened. She smiled. It wasn't a large smile. It was a faint, hesitant upturn of her lips, fragile and fleeting. But it was real. It reached her eyes, causing them to shine for a moment with a light he had never seen before. It was the most beautiful thing Eli had ever witnessed. That night, the air inside the cabin felt different, charged with an unspoken potential. When Eli banked the fire and prepared to turn in, he did something he hadn't done since she arrived. He left the door to his small bedroom open, not wide, but slightly ajar. It was not a demand. It was an answer to a question she hadn't yet asked, a signal that the bridge between them could bear weight, if she chose to cross it. He lay in his bed, listening to the sounds of the night, the cry of a distant coyote, the settling groans of the cabin. An hour passed. He thought perhaps she was asleep, that he had misread the moment on the hill. Then he heard it, the soft, almost inaudible creak of a floorboard in the main room. He held his breath. A shadow fell across the sliver of moonlight on his floor. She was standing in his doorway, a silhouette against the faint glow from the dying embers in the hearth. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She just stood there for what felt like an eternity, her presence a powerful, silent weight in the room. He could feel her indecision, her fear, her desperate, warring needs. He remained perfectly still, letting the choice be entirely hers. Finally, she glided into the room, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She stopped beside his bed. He could see her face now in the dim light, her expression a mixture of terror and longing. Her gaze was locked on his. Slowly, as if in a dream, he raised his hand. She watched the movement, her breath catching in her throat. He didn't reach for her, but simply laid his hand, palm up, on the rough wool blanket that covered him, an offering, a silent question. Her eyes flickered from his face to his hand and back again. A tear traced a glistening path through the lingering soot on her cheek. Then, with a shuddering intake of breath, she placed her hand in his. Her skin was cold. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't pull away. Their palms met, their fingers gently interlacing. It was a touch that carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. His patience, her pain, their shared solitude. They stayed like that for a long moment, their eyes holding, the silence of the room thrumming with a powerful, fragile energy. The world shrank to the space between them, to the simple, profound contact of their hands. Then she broke with a small, choked sob. She leaned forward, her free hand coming up to cup his jaw. Before he could react, before he could even process the intent, she pressed her lips to his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, frantic, and filled with a raw, aching hunger that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with a soul starved for a single, validating touch. It was a kiss of gratitude and fear, of sorrow and a terrifying, dawning hope. It was the kiss of a drowning woman breaking the surface for a gasp of air. And just as suddenly as it began, it was over. She tore herself away from him, her eyes wide with shock at her own audacity. A strangled sound escaped her throat. Before he could speak her name, she turned and fled from the room, her running footsteps echoing in the stunned silence she left behind. The next morning, an unnerving silence greeted Eli. It was deeper than the quiet he had grown accustomed to. This was the silence of absence. The coffee he'd put on the stove was still warm, but the cup he always set out for her was untouched. Her room was empty. The bed was neatly made. The flannel shirt she wore was folded on the pillow, and the tattered wedding dress lay in a heap in the corner, a crumpled, ghostly reminder. She was gone. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, pierced through him. He told himself she had just gone for a walk, that she would be back, but the methodical way her room was left, the folding of the shirt, it felt like a deliberate departure. It felt final. He saddled Buster with a frantic energy, his mind racing. Where could she have gone? She knew nothing of this land, had no horse, no supplies. The prairie was a vast and hungry thing, and she was a small, fragile flame to be extinguished by its immensity. He rode in widening circles around the ranch, his eyes scanning the horizon, calling her name until his throat was raw. The wind threw the sound back in his face. There was nothing, just the endless rolling plains and the cold, indifferent sky. Hours bled into the afternoon. His fear hardened into a grim certainty. There was only one other place, the place where it all began. He turned Buster's head and spurred him toward the east, toward the scar on the landscape where the chapel had been. He found her there, standing in the exact spot where he had first seen her, a solitary figure amidst the blackened timbers and ash. She wore the simple calico dress he had bought for her at Silas's store, and it seemed to absorb the gray light, making her appear spectral and out of place. She wasn't huddled this time. She was standing tall, her hands clenched at her sides, staring at the ruin of the altar as if it were a fresh grave. He dismounted slowly, his boots making no sound in the thick layer of soot. He walked toward her, his heart a heavy, aching drum in his chest. "Clara," he said, his voice soft. She turned to him, and the look in her eyes was one he had never seen. The fear was gone. The emptiness was gone. In their place was a profound, bottomless sorrow, and something else, a chilling resolve. "You don't know who I am," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "You see a stray, a victim, a quiet woman who helps in the garden. But that is not me." He stopped a few feet from her. "I see you, Clara." A bitter, heartbroken sound that might have been a laugh escaped her lips. "No. You see what's left. Let me tell you who I was." And then, standing in the tomb of her past, the story poured out of her. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were recounting a terrible history she had read in a book, the words worn smooth by 1,000 silent tellings inside her own mind. "My father was Reverend Miller," she began. "He was the preacher here. A good man, a man of God, but a weak man. He had debts. He liked to gamble the church offerings. You see, he always believed God would provide him with a winning hand." She looked at the charred altar. "God, it seems, had other plans. Mr. Barrow, the man you heard about, he owned my father's debts. He was a wealthy man, an important man, and he wanted a wife. A preacher's daughter. It gave him an air of respectability he could not buy otherwise." She spoke of the engagement as a transaction, a business deal where she was the currency. She was to be married in her father's chapel, her hand traded for a stack of forgiven promissory notes. She had protested, begged, but her father's shame and fear were a wall she could not break through. "The night before the wedding," she continued, her gaze turning inward, "Barrow's associates came to the chapel to celebrate. They were drinking. Men like him. Dangerous men. I was in the vestry, mending a tear in my veil, and I heard them talking, bragging." Her voice hitched for the first time. They were laughing about a homesteader named Abernathy, whose land bordered Barrow's. Abernathy wouldn't sell, so Barrow had him taken care of. He described how the man begged. He laughed about it. She fell silent, the wind sighing through the ruins. Eli took a step closer, his hands aching to reach out, to stop her, but he knew he couldn't. He had to let her finish. "In that moment, I knew I would rather die than be his wife. A killer, a monster. When they left, I gathered a few things and I tried to run. I didn't get as far as the road. He was waiting for me. He had known I would try." Her body began to tremble, the memory taking hold. "He caught me. He was displeased. He said I was sullied, impure. He said a bride who tried to run needed to be purified. He said our union had to be forged in a holy fire, a new beginning." The words were Barrow's, but the terror was hers. "He dragged me back inside. He became unkind. Then he took the lanterns from the walls and he began to break them, splashing the oil everywhere. He said he would burn the sin away, burn away my willfulness. He lit a match and the whole world just exploded." Eli's blood ran cold. He finally understood the thunder. "There's a small root cellar under the vestry," she said, her voice now a thread, "for the communion wine and preserves. I fell through the trap door when he struck me. I pulled it shut just as the flames came. I hid there, in the dark. I could hear him screaming as the roof came down. I could hear the fire. It sounded like a beast, eating the world. I stayed down there until the sound was gone, until the air ran out." She finished her story. The last word fell into the silence and was consumed. For a moment, she just stood there, swaying. Then her eyes rolled back in her head, and she crumpled like a discarded doll into the soft, gray ash. Eli caught her before she hit the ground, lifting her into his arms. A white-hot rage, pure and clean and terrible, surged through him. It was a rage directed at the dead Mr. Barrow, at her weak father, at the town that told easy stories, and at a world that allowed such things to happen. He held Clara close, her body limp and cold, and carried her away from the ruin of her past. The next day, he rode for Cheyenne. He left a sleeping Clara in the care of Martha Blackwood, Silas's wife, a stern but kind-hearted woman to whom he'd told a heavily edited version of the story. Cheyenne was a bustling, important town, a place with laws and lawyers. He found one, a man named Mr., Abercrombie, in a cramped office that smelled of stale cigar smoke and paper. Eli told him the story, leaving out no detail. The lawyer listened patiently, steepled his fingers, and stared at a spot on the wall. When Eli was finished, Abercrombie sighed. "It's a tragic tale, Mr. Grant, truly. But what is it you want me to do?" "Do?" Eli asked, incredulous. "I want justice for her, for what he did." Mr. Barrow is dead," the lawyer stated flatly. "The man cannot be tried. The case is closed. The fire was ruled an accident in a dispute with known criminals. It's neat." "It's a lie. She is a witness." "She is a traumatized woman with no proof," Abercrombie countered, his voice losing its patient edge. "Barrow's business partners practically own the territorial legislature. His name is on half the deeds in the county. Do you have any idea the kind of hornet's nest you're suggesting we kick? No one, and I mean no one, will touch this. It's over. My advice to you, sir, is to let it be over." Eli walked out of that office into the harsh sunlight, the lawyer's pragmatic words a death knell to his hope for justice. The world was just as rotten and compromised here as it was in the ashes of the chapel. When he returned to the ranch, he found Clara awake, sitting by the fire, a blanket wrapped around her. She looked up at him, and her eyes held a new and terrible kind of emptiness, the emptiness of utter despair. "It's no use, is it?" she said, her voice flat. She had known what the answer would be. He didn't have to say anything. She nodded. "It's fitting. You cannot put a dead man on trial, and you cannot fix something that has been ruined." She looked down at her hands, which were picking at a loose thread on the blanket. "That's what I am, Eli, a half-burned thing, something left over from a fire. You look at me and you are kind, and you see potential, but I am scorched through. I am not whole. I am not fit to be touched. I am not fit to be loved. I am spoiled goods, just like your mother. Only my sin is surviving." Her words were quiet, spoken with a devastating finality, as if she were stating a simple, unchangeable fact. He knelt in front of her, forcing her to meet his gaze. His own eyes burned with an intensity that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with a fierce, protective conviction. "You listen to me," he said, his voice low but powerful, each word forged in the cold fire of his anger and the deep well of his certainty. He may have set that fire. Men like that lawyer may protect his name. This world may try to tell you what you are. He reached out, his hand gentle but firm, and tilted her chin up. "But no one," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "No one has the right to destroy a person, whether with fire or with words." Eli's words hung in the cabin's silence, a declaration of war against the ghosts that haunted her. But he knew words alone were not enough. The ranch, the town, even the very air of this place was saturated with her past. The whispers of redemption were a poison, and the cabin itself was a cage, however comfortable. He saw how she looked at the walls, as if expecting them to close in, to truly fight for her. He had to take her away from the battlefield. A few days later, he packed 2 of his sturdiest horses with supplies, a canvas tent, bedrolls, sacks of flour and beans, a cast-iron skillet, and little else. He was taking her into the wilderness. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small, as she watched him lash a water barrel to a pack saddle. "Someplace new," he said, not looking at her. "Someplace the ghosts can't find us." He took her deep into the high country, to a secluded basin miles from any trail, where a narrow, life-giving river snaked its way through a vast expanse of sun-scorched earth and rock. Here, the world was stripped down to its essentials: sky, land, water, and sun. He pitched the tent under the shade of a solitary, ancient cottonwood, its leaves whispering in the constant, dry breeze. This would be their home. Their life became a simple, primal rhythm. They rose with the sun, its first pale rays painting the eastern cliffs in hues of rose and lavender. They drank coffee boiled over a fire of sagebrush and juniper. The sharp, clean scent, their only incense. He taught her how to track rabbits, how to read the clouds for the hint of rain, how to find the wild onions that grew by the riverbank. She, in turn, brought a quiet order to their camp, tending the fire, mending his worn shirts, her hands finding a new, steady purpose. They worked together to turn over a small patch of soil by the river, planting hardy seeds of squash and corn, a defiant act of faith in a land that offered little charity. The Wyoming summer settled over them, a season of brilliant, brutal heat. Dust devils spun across the plains like wandering spirits. The buzz of cicadas was a constant, high-pitched thrum from dawn till dusk. Prickly pear cacti, which looked like armed and angry sentinels, suddenly burst into delicate, waxy blossoms of impossible yellow and pink. High above, eagles and hawks rode the thermal currents, their sharp eyes scanning the baked earth, masters of this stark and beautiful kingdom. In this profound solitude, they were completely alone, but for the first time, neither of them was lonely. The vastness of the landscape gave them space to breathe, and its silence gave them permission to exist without explanation. The world was reduced to the two of them. There was no town to whisper, no past to judge them. There was only the heat of the day, the chill of the night, and the steady, quiet presence of each other. The river was their salvation. Every afternoon, when the sun reached its zenith and the heat became a physical weight, they would retreat to its banks. The water, born from distant mountain snows, ran clear and achingly cold, a shock to their sun-warmed skin. They would sit in the shallows, letting the current pull the weariness from their bodies, the silence between them now comfortable, familiar. One afternoon, the heat was more oppressive than ever. The air was still and thick, the sky a white-hot sheet of brass. Not even the eagles dared to fly. They made their way to a secluded bend in the river, where the cottonwood cast a deep, dappled shade over a small, clear pool. Eli waded in first, the cold water a welcome jolt. He watched Clara hesitate at the water's edge, her calico dress clinging to her in the humid air. She looked tired, her face smudged with dust and perspiration, but her eyes, as they met his, held a weary truce instead of the usual fear. He didn't say a word. He simply held out his hand. She looked at his hand, then back at his face. This was a different kind of offering than the one in his bedroom. This was an invitation into the here and now, a simple sharing of a moment's relief. Slowly, she began to unbutton the high collar of her dress. Her movements were stiff, uncertain. He turned his back, granting her privacy, and submerged himself to his shoulders, the cold a blissful shock that drove the air from his lungs. He heard a soft splash behind him. When he turned back, she was in the water, only her pale shoulders and head visible above the surface. Her wet hair was slicked back, revealing the delicate, vulnerable line of her neck and the fine bones of her face. The layers were gone, the dress, the dust, the armor she wore day after day. All of it had been left on the riverbank. Here, in the clear, cool water, she was just Clara. The sunlight filtered through the leaves above, scattering diamonds of light across the water and her skin. Her eyes, dark and wide, were fixed on him. In their depths, he saw a universe of emotion, fear, yes, but also a deep, aching weariness and a fragile, dawning curiosity. The air was thick with things unsaid, with the brutal heat of the day and the startling cold of the water, with the months of shared silence and the single desperate kiss in the dark. He moved toward her slowly, the water swirling around his waist. He was closing the final distance, the last few feet of carefully preserved space he had always left between them. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. He stopped when he was close enough to see the tiny, silvery beads of water clinging to her eyelashes. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, a stark contrast to the cold river. He raised a wet hand and gently, so gently, brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His calloused fingers, so accustomed to rope and leather and splintered wood, were impossibly soft against her skin. She flinched, a tremor running through her whole body, but it was the flinch of a startled deer, not a cornered animal. She didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path through the water droplets on her cheek. His hand moved from her cheek to the side of her neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin just below her ear. He felt the frantic, bird-like flutter of her pulse. He leaned in, his movements deliberate and slow, giving her every chance to retreat. When his lips met hers, it was nothing like the first time. There was no desperation, no frantic hunger. This was a kiss of profound and quiet discovery. It was soft, questioning, and tasted of river water and sunlight. The change came nearly a season later, on a bitter day when the first hint of winter was in the wind. He was in the saloon, nursing a glass of whiskey, when a freight driver tossed a crumpled, month-old newspaper from St. Louis onto a nearby table. Samuel's eyes, dull and unfocused, drifted over the page, catching on a headline from the back pages. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers. "Clara," he whispered, the name a prayer. And she broke. The iron control she had maintained for so long shattered into 1,000 pieces. Sobs racked her body. Great, gulping gasps for air. She clung to him, burying her face in the curve of his neck. He held her, his arms wrapped securely around her, letting her cry, letting all the pain and fear and shame pour out of her into the cleansing water of the river. "I'm not worthy," she wept, her voice muffled against his skin, the words torn from the deepest part of her. "Eli, I'm not clean. I'm not—" "Hush," he murmured, his lips against her temple. He held her tighter. He didn't offer platitudes or denials. He just held her, his solid presence a bulwark against her storm. After a long time, her sobs subsided into quiet shudders. She tilted her head back to look at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear, her face a heartbreakingly beautiful ruin. She reached up and framed his face with her trembling hands. "I'm not worthy," she whispered again, her voice raw. "But I need you." The admission was a surrender and a plea, the bravest thing he had ever heard. In that moment, she was not a victim, not a half-burned thing. She was a woman, choosing to live. He kissed her again, and this time she kissed him back. A deep, soul-bearing kiss of mutual need, of a hunger that went beyond the flesh. It was the desperate, beautiful collision of two solitary people who had finally found a shore in each other. They moved together in the cool water, a slow, tender, and almost painful reclaiming of themselves. It was an act born not of duty or pity, but of a fierce and desperate longing, a trust forged in silence and sealed in the heart of the wilderness. In the weeks that followed, a new and fragile peace settled over their camp, but as the fierce heat of summer began to soften into the golden light of autumn, a new fear took root in Clara's heart, a subtle change in her own body, a deep, internal shift that a woman knows. The thought, the possibility, that she might be carrying a child, bloomed in her mind like one of the desert's thorny, beautiful flowers. For another woman, it might have been a joy. For Clara, it was a terrifying verdict. A child, a permanent, living link to a body she still felt was defiled. A consequence. It would tether Eli to her forever, shackling him to her ruin. The shame she had begun to conquer came rushing back, a suffocating tide. She looked at him as he slept by the fire, his face peaceful in the flickering light, and a terrible, twisted certainty formed in her heart. She could not do this to him. She could not trap this good, kind man with her damaged legacy. The old panic, the instinct to flee, rose up, stronger than ever before. This time, it wasn't just fear for herself. It was a desperate, misguided attempt to save him. Before the sun rose, while the world was still a landscape of gray shadows. She slipped out of the tent. She took nothing but the clothes on her back and a canteen of water, with one last, heartbroken look at the sleeping man who had shown her what it was to be safe. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the vast, silent prairie. The wilderness that had been their sanctuary became Eli's purgatory. He searched for her with the quiet, dogged determination of a man who knows no other way. He knew she was on foot, with no money and no destination. He tracked her not by her footprints, which the wind erased within an hour, but by his understanding of her. She would not go toward the towns she knew. She would seek anonymity, a place to disappear. He rode a relentless circuit, visiting isolated trading posts, lonely homesteads, and the hard-scrabble settlements that clung to the edges of the territory like burrs on a saddle blanket. At each stop, the answer was the same, a shake of the head, a look of pity for the man searching for a ghost. Weeks turned into a month. The golden light of early autumn deepened into the sharp, cold clarity of the coming winter. He never considered giving up. She was a part of his landscape now. To stop looking for her would be to stop breathing. He found her at a place called Fort Mercy. It was hardly a fort, but a desolate way station built of sod and rough timber, established by a stoic, overworked doctor and his wife to serve the travelers and homesteaders who fell sick on the trail. It was a place of last resort, smelling of carbolic acid, boiled linen, and quiet despair. Eli saw her before she saw him. She was coming out of the main building, her arms laden with a pile of soiled blankets. She had changed. The wild, haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. Her hair was pulled back severely, and her face was thinner, paler. She moved with a purpose he had never seen before, a grim efficiency born of relentless, necessary work. She was no longer a victim hiding from the world. She was a soldier on the front lines of human suffering. He dismounted and waited by the corral, his heart a painful, heavy thing in his chest. She saw him on her return trip, and she froze, the blankets dropping from her arms into the dust. For a long moment, she just stared, her face a mask of shock, fear, and something he couldn't name, a deep, sorrowful guilt. He walked toward her slowly, stopping a few feet away. He didn't speak. Words were inadequate for what lay between them. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a small object that glinted in the cold afternoon sun. He held it out to her on his open palm. It was the ring, the simple gold band he had found in the ashes of the chapel. But it was different now. He had taken it to a jeweler in Cheyenne, a man who worked with his hands and understood the weight of things. The soot had been polished away, and the gold, though thin and worn, now shone with a soft, warm light. And on the inside of the band, in tiny, hand-carved letters, was an inscription. Clara looked from his face to the ring, her breath catching in her throat. She took it from his palm, her fingers trembling so badly she almost dropped it. She turned it over and read the words etched inside, her lips moving silently. Choosing each other in the ruins. A single perfect tear welled and fell, splashing onto the dusty ground. He had taken the symbol of her bondage and reforged it into a promise, a testament. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever done for her, and she knew, with a certainty that broke her own heart, that she had to refuse it. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a terrible, resolute pain. She pressed the ring back into his hand, her cold fingers closing his around it. "No, Eli," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't." "Clara," he began, his own voice rough with emotion. "You don't understand," she said, taking a step back, creating a chasm between them. "All my life, I have been someone's daughter, someone's ward, someone's betrothed, and then I was your charge. The woman you rescued, you saved me, Eli. You saved me from the chapel. You saved me from my own mind. You saved me from my solitude. But I don't know how to stand on my own. I need to learn how to live without someone saving me." Her words were a plea and a declaration. She was not rejecting him. She was trying to find herself. She was a sapling that had grown in the shadow of a great tree, and she needed to find her own son. He looked at her, at the fierce, fragile strength in her eyes, and he understood. To force the ring on her now, to demand she stay, would be to become just another man who wanted something from her. It would make his love a cage, no matter how gilded. And so, he did the hardest thing he had ever done. He let her go. He nodded slowly, the hope draining from his face, replaced by a deep, abiding respect. "If that's what you need," he said, his voice low and steady, though it cost him everything to say it. He turned without another word and walked back to his horse. He swung himself into the saddle, a movement as natural to him as breathing, and for a moment he just sat there, looking down at her. She stood, a small, lonely figure in the vast, unforgiving landscape, tears streaming silently down her face. He had saved her life, and now, to truly love her, he had to leave her to it. He rode away from Fort Mercy without looking back, but on the porch of the main building, tucked into the handle of the infirmary door where he knew she would find it, he left a small, folded piece of paper. When she found it later, her heart aching with the finality of his departure, she opened it. On it, in his simple, blocky script, were 9 words. "When you're ready to live, not just survive, find me." Clara stayed. She threw herself into the work at the infirmary with a desperate fervor. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles were raw, changed soiled bed linens, spoon-fed broth to men delirious with fever, and held the hands of the dying. She learned to dress a wound, to set a broken bone, to recognize the rattle in the chest that signaled the end. She worked from before sunrise until long after dark, pushing her body to the point of collapse, hoping that physical exhaustion would silence the relentless clamor in her soul. She saw death every day, in all its ugly, unceremonious forms. But she also saw life. She saw a homesteader's wife give birth to a healthy baby boy. She saw a young cowboy, gored by a steer, fight his way back from the brink and walk out on his own 2 feet. She learned that survival was not a passive state, but an act of ferocious, stubborn will. The world did not owe you peace. You had to carve it out of the raw, hard stone of your days. Her panic attacks, which had once crippled her, began to subside. When the familiar dread rose in her chest, she had no time to indulge it. A patient would cry out, a pot would boil over, a new wagon would arrive bearing a fresh load of human misery. She learned to push through the fear, to function in spite of it. She was saving people, not by grand gestures, but by the relentless application of soap and water, clean bandages, and a quiet, steady presence. And in saving them, she was, piece by painstaking piece, saving herself. One day, a family arrived with a small girl, no more than 6 years old, burning with fever. Her name was Sarah. Her parents were hollow-eyed with fear. Clara took the child in, sponging her forehead with cool water, trying to coax a few drops of liquid between her cracked lips. For 3 days and nights, Clara barely left the little girl's side. She saw in the child's delirious eyes a terrifying innocence she felt she had lost forever. But the fever would not break. On the 3rd night, as a cold wind howled outside, the little girl's breathing grew shallow, and she died in Clara's arms, a small, almost weightless burden. The next morning, her parents, broken by grief and the harsh realities of the trail, made a simple wooden cross and moved on, leaving their daughter behind. The doctor was too busy with the living to deal with the dead. It fell to Clara to bury the child. She wrapped Sarah's small body in a clean white sheet, carried her to a spot on a low hill overlooking the plains, and began to dig. The ground was hard and rocky, the work grueling. Each thud of the shovel into the earth was a blow to her own heart. When the grave was deep enough, She gently laid the child to rest. She stood over the small mound of earth, the wind whipping her hair and tearing at her dress. And a profound, devastating realization washed over her. This little girl had died without a choice. Her life had been stolen from her. She had never had the chance to love, to build a home, to choose her own path. And what was she, Clara, doing? She was alive. She had survived the fire. She had survived the fear. She had been offered a love as vast and real as the sky above her. And she had turned it away. She had been so focused on surviving, on proving she could stand alone, that she had forgotten how to live. She had chosen an empty existence over a life that might contain pain. Yes, but might also contain a love that could make the pain bearable. Standing over that small, lonely grave, Clara finally understood. To deny love out of fear was not strength. It was the ultimate cowardice. It was a betrayal of the gift of her own survival. She looked to the east, toward the distant hills where Eli's ranch lay. He had not asked her to be saved. He had asked to be chosen. And she knew, with a certainty that was as clear and sharp as the cold winter air, what she had to do. The decision, once made, was a fire in her blood. There was no room for doubt, no time for hesitation. Clara left Fort Mercy the way she had arrived, with nothing. She took the meager pay she had earned, a handful of coins, and turned her face to the east. The doctor's wife tried to stop her, offering her a place to stay through the winter, but Clara just shook her head, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "There is a life I need to start living," was all she said. Her journey back was a pilgrimage in reverse. The first part was on foot, a brutal testament to her newfound resolve. The unforgiving sun beat down. The dust of the trail coated her throat, and the hard, rocky ground punished her worn-out shoes. She was no longer running from something. She was walking toward everything. Every painful step was an atonement, every mile a prayer. She ate little, slept in the shelter of rock outcroppings, and felt the harshness of the land not as an adversary, but as a crucible, burning away the last of her fear and indecision. In a dusty settlement, her coins were just enough to hire a place on a freight wagon heading in the right direction. She rode for days in the back, jolting over ruts, surrounded by the smell of canvas and grain. She shared her meager rations with a family of homesteaders whose eyes held the same desperate hope she now felt in her own heart. She had to cross a river, wide and cold, its current swift. The ferryman wanted $1 she didn't have, so she waited until dusk, gathered her skirts, and waded in. The icy water shocked the air from her lungs and tried to pull her under, but she fought it, her teeth chattering, her eyes locked on the far bank. When she finally pulled herself onto the muddy shore, soaked and shivering, she felt a wild, triumphant joy. She had crossed it alone. She had not needed a savior. As she drew closer to the lands, she knew. A strange compulsion took hold of her. She left the main road and cut across the plains, her steps leading her to a familiar, scarred landmark, the chapel. She approached it with a steady heart. The ruin was still there, a skeleton of blackened timbers against the sky. But it was different now. The seasons had worked their quiet magic. Wild prairie grass, green and defiant, grew thick among the ashes. Patches of small, hardy wildflowers, purple asters and yellow goldenrod, had taken root, their bright colors a startling declaration of life in a place of death. The air no longer smelled of soot and sorrow, but of sun-baked earth and wild herbs. She walked through the gaping doorway and stood where she had once huddled in terror. She felt nothing. The ghosts were gone. She had starved them, and now nature was reclaiming their haunt. She knelt, touched a soft purple petal, and then stood and walked away, not looking back. She arrived at Eli's ranch as the sun was bleeding its last golden and crimson light across the sky. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. A profound sense of peace settled over the small valley, a peace that felt like a homecoming. The cabin was just as she remembered, a single plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. And there he was. He was on the roof of the barn, a hammer in his hand, mending a shingle that the wind had loosened. He moved with the same unhurried, capable grace she remembered so well. He was not a man who paced or worried. He was a man who endured, who mended what was broken, whether it was a roof or a soul. He was the steadiest thing in her entire life. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird in a cage. She walked across the yard, her feet silent in the thick dust. She stopped at the base of the ladder that leaned against the barn and waited. He finished driving a nail, his head down. Then, some instinct, some shift in the evening air, made him pause. He looked down, and he saw her. The hammer slipped from his grasp, clattering down the pitched roof and falling to the ground with a soft thud. He didn't seem to notice. He just stared, his face frozen in disbelief. He looked like a man seeing a vision, a specter from a dream he had long since abandoned. He remained motionless, a silhouette against the dying fire of the sunset. Clara's resolve, which had carried her across 100 miles of unforgiving territory, suddenly faltered. What if she was too late? What if he had moved on? Hardened his heart against the woman who had twice abandoned him? The silence stretched, thin and fragile. Then she remembered the little girl's grave. She remembered her promise to herself. She would not run. She took a deep, shuddering breath and did the only thing she could. She knelt in the dust at the bottom of the ladder. The movement seemed to break his trance. He scrambled down the ladder, his movements clumsy for the first time she had ever seen. He stopped on the last rung, his face level with hers, searching her eyes for an explanation. She didn't offer one. Instead, she held out her empty, trembling hand. "Eli," she began, her voice clear and strong, forged in the fires of her journey. "If you still want a bride who has run away 3 times?" She paused, her gaze unwavering. "I'm done running." He looked from her outstretched hand to her face, and in his eyes, she saw the entire lonely winter he had endured. She saw the pain of her departure and the stubborn, unbreakable hope he had refused to extinguish. A slow, wondrous light began to dawn in his expression, chasing away the shadows. He stepped off the ladder. He did not speak. He did not need to. He knelt before her in the dust, taking her hand in both of his. His calloused, warm grip was an anchor, a promise, a final, unconditional welcome. He looked into her eyes, and in that single, silent gaze, he gave her the lifetime she had been so afraid to claim. He lifted her to her feet, and the world settled into its rightful place around them. They did not wait for a preacher or for the town's approval. Their union was a covenant with each other, witnessed only by the elements that had shaped them. A few days later, they stood by the bank of the river that wound through his valley. The autumn wind sang a low, solemn hymn through the cottonwoods, and the last of the season's wildflowers served as her bouquet. Eli wore a clean shirt, and Clara wore the simple calico dress she had journeyed in, now washed and mended. There were no rings, no sermons, no pronouncements. Eli held a simple, battered guitar, one his father had owned, and he played. He didn't play a hymn or a wedding march, but a quiet, nameless melody that spoke of long, lonely nights and patient hope. It was a song of the prairie, of the vast, open spaces inside a man's heart. When he finished, he set the guitar down, took her hands in his, and said the only vows that mattered. "Clara." "Eli," she answered, and they were married. That night, in the small, clean cabin, with the fire casting a warm, flickering glow on the walls, Clara felt a tremor of the old fear. The wedding night, a phrase that had once been a death sentence, a symbol of violation and terror. Eli seemed to understand. He didn't approach her with a husband's demand, but with the same gentle patience he had shown her from the very first day. He simply sat with her by the fire, talking softly about his plans for the ranch, about the coming winter, about the foal he hoped would be born in the spring. He rebuilt their world with quiet, ordinary words. When he finally led her to the bedroom, it was not as a groom leading a bride, but as a man leading his partner home. The room was filled with the clean scent of pine and fresh linen. He had put wildflowers in a jar by the bed. He undressed her slowly, his touch not one of passion, but of reverence. He unbuttoned her dress as if unwrapping a priceless, fragile gift. And when she stood before him, her skin luminous in the firelight, he did not look at her with hunger, but with a kind of awe. He traced the faint lines of the scars on her back, the ghosts of Barrow's cruelty, and his touch was not one of pity, but of acceptance. He was mapping the country of her pain and claiming it as his own. When they finally came together, it was a communion. For Clara, it was a profound act of reclamation. This was not a violation, but a choice. It was not a submission, but a meeting of equals. Every touch was a question, and every response a confirmation of her trust. This was not the fire that consumed, but the hearth that warmed. It was the quiet, powerful healing of two souls who had found each other in the ruins and in the deep, silent darkness of the night. Finally became whole. Their marriage did not magically erase the world's judgment. Love, they learned, was not a fortress that kept hardship out, but a hearth that kept them warm within it. When they rode into redemption for supplies, they were met with a wall of silence and sidelong glances. The women would pull their children closer, their faces tight with disapproval. The men at the saloon would stop talking when Eli entered, watching him with a mixture of pity and contempt. The town's neat and tidy story had been complicated by Eli Grant's choice. He had taken in damaged goods, and in their eyes, the stain had spread to him. Clara felt their stares like a physical blow, a phantom pain from an old wound. In the early days, she would shrink into herself, the old shame coiling in her gut. But then she would feel Eli's hand, steady and warm on the small of her back, a silent, unyielding declaration. He never confronted the whispers. He never defended their honor with words. He simply stood by her side, his presence a quiet and unshakable fact. And slowly, Clara learned to draw strength from it. She began to hold her head a little higher, to meet the cold stares with a calm neutrality that offered no purchase for their judgment. They were two solitary islands who had chosen to become a continent. The rest of the world and its opinions lay across a wide and turbulent sea. Then came the winter. It descended upon the high plains not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a ruthless, invading army. The winds howled with a desolate fury, piling drifts as high as the cabin roof. The temperature plummeted to a point where the very air seemed to crackle and shatter. For weeks, they were snowed in. Their world reduced to the four walls of the cabin, the path to the barn, and the endless howling expanse of white. It was a trial by ice and isolation, but instead of breaking them, it forged them closer. They developed a rhythm, a silent dance of survival. They fed the livestock, chopped wood, melted snow for water, and in the long, dark evenings, they would sit by the fire. He would play his father's guitar, and she would read to him from the one book of poetry he owned, her voice a soft anchor in the storm. It was during that brutal, beautiful winter that Clara's quiet hope began to grow. The fear she'd had at Fort Mercy was confirmed. She was with child, but now, in the safety of Eli's love, the fear was transformed into a fragile, wondrous joy, a new beginning, a life forged not in fire and terror, but in love and quiet resilience. But the prairie gives, and the prairie takes. The spring thaw came late, and with it, a sudden, violent illness. A fever took hold of Clara, leaving her weak and delirious for a week. Eli nursed her with a desperate, terrified tenderness. But when the fever finally broke, it left behind a devastating emptiness. She had lost the child. The grief was a physical thing, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. The pain was immense, but the shame was worse. It was the old ghost, returned in its most cruel form. The voice in her head whispered that she was unworthy, that her body was a ruin incapable of nurturing life, that the fire had scorched her clean of any right to be a mother. The darkness she had fought so hard to escape beckoned her, a familiar, suffocating abyss. She lay in their bed, turned her face to the wall, and began to drift away. Eli was lost. He had fought fire and fear and loneliness to bring her back to the world. But he did not know how to fight this. He saw her slipping away, saw the light in her eyes dimming, and his own strength, for the first time, faltered. He sat by the fire late one night, his head in his hands, a despair as vast and cold as the winter snow settling over him. He had failed her. His love had not been enough to protect her. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see Clara standing beside him, her face pale and drawn in the firelight, but her eyes clear. She was wrapped in a quilt, her frame fragile, but her gaze was steady. "Eli," she said, her voice soft but firm. He couldn't speak. He just looked at her, his own pain and helplessness stark on his face. She knelt in front of him, the way he had once knelt before her. She took his large, calloused hands in her own. "This is not the fire," she said, her voice imbued with a strength he had never heard. "This is not a punishment. This is not a judgment on us." She squeezed his hands. "This is grief, and it is ours. We will carry it together, but we will not live in it. I will not let you." In that moment, their roles were reversed. He was the one adrift in the darkness, and she was the anchor. Having walked through her own personal hell, she had learned the map. She knew the way back. She was not the rescued. She was the rescuer. She did not offer him platitudes or false hope. She offered him the simple, powerful truth of their partnership. She held him as he finally let his own grief pour out, his strong shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She did not save him. She simply held the space for his sorrow, and in doing so, created the space for her own, until they were just two people, holding each other, their shared loss a bond, not a chasm. In the summer that followed, they found a new purpose. One day, on a ride, they stopped at the ruins of the chapel. It was overgrown now, a place of wild, stubborn beauty. "A place of such pain should not be left to the weeds," Clara said, looking at the charred timbers. "And a place built for hope should not be left a ruin." And so, they began to rebuild it. They did not rebuild it for God or for a congregation. They hauled new timber from the mountains. They cleared the ash and laid a new foundation. Eli's skill with an axe and hammer and Clara's quiet, steady resolve raised new walls from the ashes of the old. The town of Redemption watched, mystified. They were not building a church. They were building a school. It was Clara's vision, a place for the children of the territory who had no one, the orphans of the trail, and more. A place for the women the world had cast aside, the young widows with no prospects, the girls who had made a mistake and been thrown out by their families. It would be a sanctuary, a place to learn, to work, to heal. They would call it the New Hope School. They were taking the site of her deepest trauma and transforming it into a beacon for others. They were choosing each other, and in doing so, choosing to make the world a little less cruel. Years passed. The school flourished, a small, bustling community of mended souls. Eli and Clara's life was not one of great wealth or ease, but it was rich with purpose. They never had another child of their own, but their home was filled with the laughter and tears of the dozens they cared for. The lines on their faces deepened, etched by sun and sorrow and joy. Their love, too, deepened, settling into a quiet, powerful rhythm, as comfortable and constant as the turning of the seasons. One evening, as winter was once again closing its fist around the high plains, they sat before the fire in their small cabin. The wind was howling outside, a familiar, lonely sound. A candle flickered on the table, casting long, dancing shadows. Eli was oiling a piece of leather, and Clara was mending a child's torn shirt. A deep, companionable silence filled the room. Eli looked up from his work, his eyes finding hers in the warm, golden light. He smiled, a slow, gentle expression that still made her heart ache with a fierce, protective love. "Do you still fear it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Forever?" Clara put down her sewing. She looked at his dear, weathered face. She looked at the strong, kind hands that had pulled her from the ashes, that had held her through the darkness, that had worked alongside her to build a new life. She thought of the journey, of the fires and the floods, the losses and the quiet victories. The fear was a distant country now, a place she had once visited but no longer lived. She reached across the small space between them and laid her hand on his. The wind rattled the window pane, a reminder of the wild, unpredictable world outside. She looked at the flames dancing in the hearth, a steady, contained fire that warmed but did not consume. "No," she said, her voice soft but certain, clear as a winter star. "Because forever isn't a promise someone makes to you. It's a choice you make. It's choosing each other, every day, in the ruins." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire, their hands clasped together. Two souls who had found their home not in a place, but in each other, no longer afraid of the dark. Thank you for listening to this story here on Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let us know. If you enjoyed this tale, be sure to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. We'll see you around the next campfire.